Back again, Prelude to Ulysses. Still sick. We're going to continue the Book of the Child, Part 2. Last time I made it not far. But our hero, Menenhedet I, was still thinking about how his mom and great-grandpa were hooking up, and he remembered how because of that and him wandering around or something, he got a BJ from Ayasayab, his maid or something. Even though he's like 6 years old or something. She called it Sweet Finger. Ugh. So gross. And then, so that's the night before the boat ride where the grandpa is there. Menenhedet II is on this boat. I do not think that's metaphorically. I think I was confused. And then, Menenhedet's dad's trying to be like, talk to his wife and grandpa. Ugh. Trying to like be like, hey man, this fucking river stinks, I guess. But Menenhedet II and Hathfertiti seem to like the stink of the Nile. And I don't understand, sometimes the river rises horrendously and gets all stinky and all the sheep get all close to everybody. I think that's where we're at. I'll read the last sentence of what I read last. Oh, it's a huge sentence. Holy fuck. That's one sentence? What, are you kidding me? I think this whole thing is one sentence. I think this whole thing's one sentence. Okay, this whole fucking paragraph. Give me 1 second. Of course, nothing was equal to our river when it began to rise, and each old slime on the flats began to stir with its last odors as the water reached higher under the caked mud and old reeds, while feast of insects floated down on the foliage, a terrible smell for a week, as if our earth was shucking its filthiest skin. Each village, now an island with its own high ground, offering the new stench of sheep and cattle pressed together for those few weeks, close enough to sleep in the huts of their peasant masters. An atrocious condition, but for nights of full moon, when the villages would look like dark islands on Silver Lake, and the poorest boat, not big enough for 2 men, just a tying and twisting of long dry reeds coated with pitch, would appear as elegant in such light as the skiffs of papyrus on which my great-grandfather, my father, and their friends would now and then embark on a hunt. That was one sentence. No joke, one sentence. Why? Whatever. All right, let's get started. I'm going to try to actually read the whole thing, and we'll see how I feel, right? It's kind of a lot. But on this fine morning, when my father made his comment, the stench was gone, and the river was no longer green from the first sludge of the fields, but high and red with the mud of the earth it had washed from cliffs upriver. A golden red, usually near to brown in color, except on this exceptional morning, when the sun was so brilliant that the gleam coming off the river was equal to 100 suns, an emblazoning of gold upon red waters that lit up every passing bark, until the meanest barge full of cabbages or jugs of oil, pots of grain, or near awash with a fine load of fine stone shimmered nonetheless in the light like a royal galley. And I remember one scow floating beside us, its decks heaped with bales of papyrus that looked as white in the reflection as the best of treated linen. One sentence. Try then to look into the blinding light that came up from the gold and silver hull of a state barge of the king being rowed upstream. Who's the king? With a royal officials to take on Pharaoh's duty, with a group of royal officials to take on Pharaoh's duty in the towns in the south. They stood beside a huge altar of gold in the stern, larger than 5 men kneeling side by side, a gift no doubt from Ramses IX to one of his temples. And the officials cheered as they saw the pennants on the golden falcon in the bow of Menenhedet's ship, and we nodded in our turn on the coiled cobras of gold on the raised cabin of the state barge. The royal ship was rowed by 60 oarsmen, for there was no wind. 30 in a row on either side, and with the speed they raised, no breeze could have taken them upriver as quickly. Their mast stood alone, its great red mainsail furled. The mast straight as Sweetfinger last night. No laughing. But covered with gold. There was not anything on the boat that did not shine of gold or silver, but for the straw matting on the decks and the carved purple bulwarks of the oarlocks in the rail. In pace with its progress, a troop of charioteers guarded the treasures of the barge while marching down the road that led along the higher bank of the river. And an infantry of archers jogged them in a trot to keep even with the pace of the oarsmen. Their equipment jiggling, then a squadron of lances with colored flags and plumed Babylon horses I saw, and 2-man chariots, purple, orange, red, and a yellow as saffron as the color of my own robes, were on the plumes and ribbons of the horses, and the painted medallions of the chariots. Naked children ran after them for as long as they could keep up, naked but for a bracelet or an armband. And I saw a few stare at my yellow robes in awe. But when one boy my age looked at me and I at him across the water, he bowed and kissed the ground. Meanwhile, every sound was going back and forth between the soldiers and the women they passed, a merriment as happy as the washing of the river, and greetings and even applause kept passing between our boat and the soldiers, as though today were a festival, and open salutations were permitted. Just before we drew away from them around the bend in the river, so we came on some blacks by the bank, playing the tambourines in such a frenzy that my mother murmured, "The passing of the Pharaoh's barge is what has excited them so." 2 beautiful black girls were also in this frolic and squealed with delight when one of the mercenaries, a Mede with amazing blonde hair, Mede, took off his helmet and bowed flirtatiously as his chariot pulled by. Even Hi Lotus, scare me, God. As his chariot pulled by. Even the harper on our boat, a sour priest who wore a leopard's skin, of which he was very proud, over the white linen of his ceremonial dress, condescended to pluck a string of his lyre, and the negroes whistled at the clarity of his tone. Red as the mud of the banks were the dates ripening on the trees, and I thought the state barge looked like the golden bark of Ra being rowed across the sky, even as it went by the bend in the glare of the sun. It was the grandest sight I had ever seen on the river. But I was to witness a greater one in the next hour, when we came to the outskirts of Memphis. For an obelisk of black marble, as long as the 60 paces of the wading pool in my great-grandfather's garden, was being carried on the longest barge I'd ever seen, and it was drawn by leather ropes, thick as a man's arms, that were tied to 18 smaller boats built only for towing, and therefore so narrow that they could hold no cargo but their own oarsmen pulling in 2 rows of 15 men side by side. How great must have been the burden of that black marble obelisk with its golden tip. I remember Bone Smasher and Eater of Shadows, seeing such an armada of oarsmen, stood up in our boat as though they were dogs trained for fights to the death, and were measuring the heat it would put on their 7 souls and spirits to row the obelisk up the river. The long cry of that labor came across the water, a cry which did not come to an end. The separation between the 18 boats was wide enough for each sound to reach us by a separate route. And so it was like the overlapping frenzy of a myriad of birds when their feeding is disturbed. For that matter, the true sound of birds could have been in those cries, since the armada had certainly attracted them. Hawks, herons, crows, turkey vultures, hoopoes, kept to a circle above, as if at any moment one of the oarsmen would collapse and be thrown overboard, and behind the great barge Carrying the obelisk, kingfishers glided over the water and dove in frequently for the catch. Something in its deep wake drew the fish. Maybe it was no more than the unusual wash. Not many a boat went up the Nile, opening such waves. Even while we watched, one kingfisher was sucked under the curl and came up drowned. A vulture leaped away with that death, its cruel wings giving off an exuberance like the spring of a good sword on the bright morning air. On the bank, laid out on mats, catfish were drying in the sun, with a net stretched over them on poles to protect the catch from the birds. And a boy balanced himself on top of one of the poles and kept trying to hit the larger hawks with a stick. A hare, cut off in the flood from the safety of the desert, came wandering by. The boy threw his stick at the hare, missed, and fell off his perch, so producing a merry laugh from Hathfertiti. We were coming to the temples for Baal, Baal, and Astarte, Astarte, at the outskirts of Memphis. Foreign temples were put up by Syrians and other such people from the east, and I heard my parents speak of how they were not impressive as buildings. Oh, the temples they were not impressed by. Although new, they were only made of wood, and the paint was peeling. Their foundations were dirty with river mud. Indeed, they were surrounded by all the confusion of the foreign quarter, with its miserable little houses, crooked streets, and narrower than the lanes of the necropolis. In one-room hovels of unbaked brick, so poor they had been built to share a common wall and leaned on each other. A dissatisfaction came into our mood at this sight, as if even the water reflected the squalor, and our priest in the leopard-skin cape made a point of spitting over the side as we passed the temples, for which act Menenhedet reached over and pinched his cheek, as though to mock the fellow for the solemnity, Solemnity of his aversion. The priest returned a sickly smile and promptly bowed his shaved head to the floor. Menenhedet languidly removed a sandal and offered his foot for the priest to kiss, which set my buttocks tingling once more, for the priest, slyly, I thought, slipped his tongue like a snake in and out of Menenhedet's toes. Play on the strings, Menenhedet said, withdrawing his leg, and the priest reached for the harp and began to play a song about a white palette that asked to be loved by its red and black cakes of ink. A silly song, and hardly to the taste of my parents and great-grandfather, although I enjoyed it, for I was still thinking of the look on the priest's face when he bent over my great-grandfather's toes. It had been so much like the happy snarl of a dog going at meat. My father, however, looked irritated, as if the abominations of pride in that priest had been no more agreeable to witness than Menenhedet's complacency before such caresses. If no one could make love to him without such abasement, where did that leave my mother? Leave it that my father detested chaos, filth, and inelegance. Not for too little was he the overseer of the cosmetic box, even as we were drifting past that abysmal foreign quarter, so blatant in its wretchedness as to destroy all good mood in someone like himself. My father said, "It's not worth the burning." What is it? Well, said Hathfertiti, I don't know what he's talking about. Well, said Hathfertiti, there could be a nicer approach to the city. It's not even worth it to burn it? Is that what the dad's saying? Jesus. Fucking poor people. Not worth cooking. Jesus Christ. Gnarly. Well, said Hathfertiti, there could be a nicer approach to the city. Couldn't they move these people inland? Too swampy back there, said Menenhedit. Why not up the hill, said Hathfertiti, pointing to a cliff that must have been a half-hour's walk from the river. It was a hill that I knew and liked. Some servants had taken me there on a long walk, and those cliffs had bees' nests high in the hollows of the rock. The boys who lived in the hovel here on the river used to climb halfway up the cliff, dare the bees, collect the honey, and descend. The servants with me laughed at how they had to suffer bee stings on the way down with the honey. But from my protected place, flanked by 2 servants, I thought the boys were remarkable, so I listened carefully to talk of moving the foreign quarter onto the hill. It cannot be done, said Menenhedit. That is exactly where the Nile talks of building a new fort, where Nine talks of building a new fort. I don't know what Nine, the Council of Nine is. I should pay more attention. I still don't see, Hathfertiti remarked, why they can't move these people. The fort will never get put up. You have a mind for military matters, remarked my great-grandfather. I was merely hoping that they would not build the fort too quickly, so that someday, when old enough, I would also be brave enough to go up to those cliffs for honey. And I thought of how little I knew of the manner in which such boys lived, poor boys who worked for their fathers in the fields near the river, and shivered so much at the picture that my mother drew me into the perfumed and shivered so much at the picture that my mother drew me into the perfumed and wondrously delicate pillows of her scented breast and belly, and whispered, "The child dare not be ill again." And my father looked gloomy, for when I was ill, he had to pay attention to Hathfertiti's woes. "No, the boy will be all right," said my father. My great-grandfather gave me a look out of his large, pale gray eyes, which in this bright light were like clear sky, and asked, "What is the color of your blood?" I knew he was thinking of our last conversation. So I answered, "As red as it was last night." He nodded. "And the sun?" "The sun is golden, but we call it yellow." "He is truly intelligent," breathed Hathfertiti. "And the sky," said my great-grandfather, "is blue?" "Yes, it is blue." "Explain, then, if you can, the origin of such other colors as brown, orange, green, and purple." "Orange is the marriage of blood and the sun, so it is the color of fire. My mother had told me that, so she now added, green is the color of grass." But I was annoyed. I had been ready to give the explanation myself. "Yes, grass," I said, "is green, even as the sky is blue and the sun is yellow." Menenhedit did not smile. "Speak of the origin of the color of brown," he said. I nodded. I did not feel at all like a child. Menenhedit's thoughts lived so clearly with mine that I had only to take a breath and feel the power of his mind. "Brown," I said, "is like the river. In the beginning, the Red Nile was a river of blood in the sky. Now the child will certainly catch fever." Hathfertiti murmured, "Why?" "Brown," I said, "is like the river. In the beginning, the Red Nile was a river of blood in the city." Oh, confusing chapter. "Now the child will certainly catch fever," Hathfertiti murmured. "Nonsense," said Menenhedit. "May the child not be ill," said my father. I don't know. I had certainly stopped shivering, and my body felt lucid. "Is purple a mixture of blood and sky?" I asked Menenhedit. "Of course," he replied. "That is why it is also the color of madness." He nodded. Just that is why the purple is also the color of madness." He nodded. "Just as the rich earth is brown, since all colors go back to it. Just so," he said with an evil addition. "Is your caca brown?" I laughed with delight. "But what makes it the color of white?" I asked. "But what makes the color of white?" "The child is not stupid," he murmured. He took me by the chin. "You are yet too young," he said, "to comprehend the color of white. That is the most mysterious of hues." He frowned at the look of disappointment on my face. Think for now, he said, of white as the color of stone, for that is where the gods take their rest. Is this why temples are made of marble? Doubtless, he said, and remarked to my mother, an exceptional wit. It convinces me that our blood is brilliant. He could not, however, keep from smiling. Of course, given the intertwinings of Ramses, it is a wonder why we have any sense at all. My father was in misery. I implore you, do not say such things, he murmured, even as the small scratch of those sounds on his ear would leave telltale marks of disloyalty to the pharaoh upon his face. Fun thought. The slow drift of our boat had stimulated the merchants of the foreign quarter, and a dozen came out to us in skiffs of every cheap description, some not better than a wooden case latched to papyrus reeds. One was on a raft with 2 logs for pontoons, and others rowed up in small wooden scows. They bore down full of cargo for sale, some, for example, with vases of oil, lamp oil, castor oil, oil of sesame. One idiot selling bowls of flax and barley actually tried to interest my mother in his bargains. Exceptional fair price, he kept calling out in atrocious Egyptian, and became so persistent that he almost lost his balance. For Bone Smasher, wielding one of the long oars, kept swinging it through the air at him, although as casually as raising an arm in greeting. But the barley man kept his boat just beyond the edge of the oar blade, until perceiving at last from the indifference of my mother that he could yell his wares for hours and shift no affection in her to flax or barley, he bowed with courtesy and turned away to give space to another. They all came near. Boats with every kind of fruit and spice, boats with raw clay to sell, and milk and henna, and one with turfs of dung that stank so bad my mother cried out in annoyance, and Bone Smasher almost fell in the fury with which he had laid down his oar, took up his river pole, and shoved the other prow away. Indeed, he left a hole in the dung boat, right through the dried reeds. Another came by with wigs, and Hathfertiti allowed it to come close. Studied a few heads of hair across the water. I knew she was afraid of picking up lice, and looked only for purposes of comparison to her own wigs. Then waved the craft away. So she does have wigs. A skiff came by with 2 pigs for sale. At the look in Bone Smasher's eye, it backed water quickly. Pig was not to be offered to us. Another boat had geese and cranes, ducks and hens. We were not buying. A scow with 2 wooden cages showed a hyena and a gazelle. Is the hyena male or female? My father asked of the Eater of Shadows, who repeated the question to the boatsman. And when the answer was given by way of making a circle with a finger and thumb, my father shook his head. The pharaoh has a female hyena already. I thought if there was a male... Interrupting. Has Ptah-Nimhotep succeeded in domesticating his hyena? Asked my great-grandfather. The pharaoh performs wonders in taming his animals, said my father, with implacable piety. I have seen him walk the hyena on a leash. My great-grandfather was reputed to have wrestled with a lion. But he merely smiled, and looked up at a covey of quail flying over our boat, their little wings beating as fast as the tongues of hummingbirds. A little scow, brightly painted, came by. Its merchant was its only sailor, a young man dressed in a white skirt, his body well painted in a red ochre. He made an agreeable appearance, and Bone Smasher, at a sign from Menenhetet, allowed him to draw near. He was selling cosmetics, but his oils, almond and sesame with perfume added, were of low quality. Since my mother did not wish to disappoint his attractive face, as if such cruelty might reduce the beauty of her own features, she settled at last on some Asiatic pomade, a peculiar mixture that the young merchant assured her speaking with his head down and through the intermediary of our boatman, was of his own invention and used on his own hair, since that was as dark as a black olive and as lustrous as its oil. Hathvertiti asked by way of Eater of Shadows, if oil that came from black olives was the base of his cosmetic. And when he said yes, she was able to analyze the odor. You have used oil of dates for fragrance, she said. The princess is wise, he replied. But that is not all your concoction. Great princess, there is one hair of a black dog, fierce as a wolf, in the bottom of the vase. And if the hair is not removed, so will the strength of your own hair not leave. He managed with considerable stammering to assure Eater of Shadows. I was giggling because the young merchant did not look at my mother, but spoke to the ugly-faced Eater of Shadows, who had an enormous nose. Not the other guy, called Nose, right? Whatever. As if he were the great princess. I thank you for protecting the strength of my hair, said Hathvertiti, but there is a strange odor in your mixture as well. It is the ground powder of horses' hooves, said the young man. Horses' hooves, said Eater of Shadows. Horses' hooves, said Hathvertiti. After a pause, laughed merrily. Hooves for the roots of your hair, princess, and the health of your scalp. Need some more tea. Hooves for the roots of your hair, princess, and the health of your scalp. She purchased the oil, and my father gave a small ring worth 5 copper inu in payment. The young man bowed in recognition that he had not been obliged to haggle for his price, and when we drifted away, he continued to look in our direction with such an admiration as to wish to remain with us forever. My great-grandfather grunted. A pretty boy, he said. Looks full. There's a lot, I guess, I should quit giggling about all the bisexuality in here. It catches me by surprise. Also, it's pretty pedophilic, too. That's probably another part of why it strikes me as odd. A pretty boy. Looks full of the love of his mother, said my father. Menenhetit nodded. For once, he found agreement with my father. I would advise him to stay out of the army. My father guffawed, Guffawed, guffawed. It was a coarse sound to come out of his elegance, but the thought of the young merchant rudely used by troops made him laugh, and most suddenly. I don't believe, said Hathvertiti, that I will use his oil for my hair, but it will go well on my breasts. Bound to, said Menenhetit. All those horses' hooves. My father guffawed again, and Menenhetit offered a warm and malicious look. Around the bend, we left the foreign quarter. Ow! Jesus. It's a hot cup. Around the bend, we left the foreign quarter. Now the white walls of Memphire were shining on the bank. We floated past the marble splendor on the temple of Ptah and its sacred gardens, but only a few priests in white were to be seen on the paths. Then the temple of Hathor appeared around another bend. Is that where he lives? Here my mother had had her way. Here, if my mother had had her way, would the town of Memphis have made its first appearance. These temples and parks told of the magnificence of our city. The serpentine wall was as delightful as the eye of a necklace of white stones, and behind was a view of high columns on 2 successive hills, with a garden in between. That was the last fine space we were to see. The river spread out around the next bend until it was as wide as a lake, and to the left of all of Memphis before our eyes, the harbor, the stone wharfs for unloading cargo, the shipyards, the jetties, the causeways, the canals, the granaries, and every crowded house on every rise of ground. Yes, there was our white city, so recently red with dust in the dry season, now a bit muddy. It hardly mattered. Coming around this last bend was like entering the gates before I could even pick out the faces of the workers on the docks, or soldiers guarding the marketplaces, not yet close to the clamor of the shops or the cries of traffic on the avenue. I still knew the air on the river was different and full of messages. How splendid the city looked in the sunlight. Even the dust of the quarries shimmered. The water pails of 1,000 shaduffs I'm not doing dictionary stuff today. The water pails of 1,000 shadows. I think that torch or something? No. Oh, it's a type of person. The water pails, Pails, of 1,000 shadows kept rising and falling at the end of their poles, lifting water into sluices above them that passed the water into other shadows up onto higher sluices, until there was water for the fountains in the city in every square. It's a bucket on a thing. Were there 1,000 or was it 5,000 slaves cranking the long poles of these shadows to raise our water? I knew as we looked from the boat across the high shimmering river, I could hear the shadows creaking near and far. And the sun blazed like a sword each time the water splashed into a higher sluice. In the basin of the harbor of Memphis, we came to a mammoth eddy between the jetty and the docks. Our boatmen unlashed their oars and began to row us by a short route through a canal that went behind a long promontory of the harbor. That way, to my pleasure, took us through a part of the city I did not often see. As I passed close to temples built, as my mother exclaimed, 1,000 years ago. They now sat in the depression of old, damp holes. These temples were made of stone and therefore had endured after the wooden buildings that once swarmed around them had collapsed, and the brick buildings, molded from mud and straw, had washed away in one or another of our terrible rainstorms. The kind that came once every 50 years. My mother told me of how she saw such a storm when she was a child. And the roofs of palm thatch in poor houses came apart like old wet cloth. So the houses around these temples kept being rebuilt until the new on top of the old reached to half the height of these temples, and left them in damp hollows, dark, old gray stone, mournful as hippopotami fallen into pits. Around them, on each side of the canal, was all the din of the workshops and our local markets. Quickly, for the boatmen rowed hard through many a smell of sawdust and leather, manure, rotting papyrus, and stone dust that blew over the canal from the mason shops, past every whiff of bleaches that scoured my nose. We went by the woodworking shops and matting shops, past the sandal makers, and a shop for the repair of harnesses and chariots. Went by a forge and a stable, and the linen factories of the weavers. Come on! Just give me a period. Jesus. So, the fact... That's just, we're making a period. The linen factory of the weavers, past the embalmers, the shops of the undertakers and coffin makers, past a woman at a loom working in the open air at the front of her shop, not 5 feet from the edge of the canal, and next to her a courier was scraping the skin of a leopard, an awful odor coming from the big dead cat to make my mother gag. These are fucking insane sentences, okay? I'm struggling to pay attention to this one a little more than the others, but I am not full speed. So we won't judge it. Maybe I'm just dumb. Farther along, we came to the back of a furniture shop, and I saw 2 workers carried out a chest of ebony inlaid in silver. Beautiful enough for the pharaoh, it was being placed now, even as we went by, on a barge. And White Teeth, the handsomest of our boatmen, called out, "Is that for 2 gates?" And the worker on the dock replied, "It goes south, to the estate of the great Menenhedet," which left a ripple of laughter on our gilded barge, and even the oarsmen dared to join, for at that moment it was as if all of us on the boat belonged to the same family. At the end of the short canal, we came back to the harbor. The shops of the perfumers sweetened the air, And there were larger markets and a school for priests, one long low building with white wooden pillars. Just past was a wig shop, and I saw one for a small boy, a beautiful blue, and would have asked my mother to get it for me as a gift, but the boatmen were rowing hard, and I felt an uneasiness in their boat, and recognized then that my great relatives were thinking of how soon they would see the Pharaoh. At the end of the canal, where we joined the river again, there was a plaza, and it was filled with every kind of priest and noble, soldier and boatman and foreign trader, artisan, peasant, slave, water carrier, caravan hand, donkey driver, and many a woman of all kinds, and even a few ladies. What the fuck does that mean? To look at all these people from our boat never failed to please me. I felt so safe. It was another matter to walk through them. Then Ayesab was full of was full of fear because every drunken soldier and vendor stared at her thighs, and I, walking beside her at just such a height, had to look into her eyes, into their eyes. Oh. On the water, however, I could feel more cheerful. Each wine shop and beer house had its colored awning up, drumming and flapping like sails in the breeze off the harbor, and I could see people waiting in front of one, famous for its roast goose, to take home a cooked bird. On the far side of the plaza, near the streets and canals behind, in an open space guarded on three sides by newly built high walls, and on the fourth by a line of soldiers with their arms linked, was a new open-air shop set up by an edict of the Pharaoh. It had caused more talk in Memphis, at least to measure by the amount of conversation in my family, than any of his decisions in some time. For at this shop, some of the silver ingots his boats brought back from Tyre, Tyre, and even a fair amount of the gold his caravans had returned from the granite mountains near the Red Sea, was now being fashioned by royal artisans into amulets, breast pieces, gold collars, bracelets, scarabs, uraei, even gold and silver shabti. While jewelry and other foreign treasures as scented woods and gums, coral and amber, linens and glasswork and embroideries were for sale to the few people on this plaza who could afford the price. Everyone who could not pressed nonetheless against the line of soldiers for a look. Until now, such ornaments had always been made in the shops of the palace, within the workrooms of the temple of Ptah, or on estates as large as Menenhedet's. So eager was the crowd, therefore, to see these treasures being worked upon by royal craftsmen, that some knelt to have a peek between the guards' legs, and groans of admiration went up whenever a foreign trader or some wealthy local official was admitted through the lines of soldiers, for he would be able to touch the objects himself. Touch the objects themselves, and each night to prevent theft, the products, the tools, and even the precious dusts of the metalwork were gathered up in velvets, locked in boxes, and carried away under the guard to a royal vault. The next morning, they were returned to the plaza again. Now, as if the gleam of such valuables at the end of the plaza brought a glimpse of the end of their journey, the boatmen began to lean on their oars, full strength coming from stinking body and white teeth, eater of blood, eater of shadows, head on backwards, and he of the nose. That's the one. They all began to weigh on their oars, and Bone Smasher called the cadence. Our heavy barge picked up the current as we came out of the eddy, and our prow lifted in the water, and the river began to sing with the speed of our efforts as we came around the last point past the plaza, and saw in full display along the curve of the next bank the limestone walls of the two gates, which rose as high as the 3 stories of Menenhedet's house. Sentries. I'll remember to look up what the hell 2 gates is. See if it's actual. Let's look up where Menfi is too. I think 2 gates is like the walkway to the Pharaoh's palace. The limestone walls of 2 gates, which rose as high as the 3 stories of Menenhet's house. Sentries stood on the parapets above. Before our boat was even tied to the mooring, a suite of sedan chair carriers, resting in the shadow of the wall, came running towards us, across a long, open marble plaza, down to the stone steps by the river. "Have use of our services, great lord," their leader called to Menenhet. As a signal, the others knelt, bowed, and struck their heads to the marble floor. "Who has need of your poor chairs?" said my great-grandfather. "The legs of my family are young." Menenhet, you're just so funny. "Oh, my lord, there is great weight in every step that takes you nearer to his presence. I cannot bear to think of the woe my body would put on your crooked back," replied Menenhet. Dude's just shucking insults. "Great lord, the chair weighs less when a noble lord like you is in it." "Lord, I lay my face on the seat before you sit down," said the leader, and was immediately copied by the other bearers, who embraced the seat of their sedan chairs. "And do you kiss it after you are done carrying me?" "Then I must kiss it twice," said the bearer. What a fucking... "For your courtesy," said Menenhet, "take us through the red gate and to the end of the courtyard." And my mother, my father, my great-grandfather, and myself all sat in separate chairs and were lifted and carried across the marble plaza, between the river and the walls of the palace. But even as we came nearer, we saw frightful sights. By the wall was a wretch with his neck manacled to a collar, then chained to a post. His hands must have been cut off but a few hours ago, and the stumps of his forearms were bound with leather thongs to keep him from bleeding to death. Yet his blood still dripped on the stone. Leaning forward in his chair, Menenhet asked, "What did you steal?" "He, the great god Nine among us, is kind to let me live because I stole too much," the wretch replied. It was not easy to hear him, as the price for an old crime, lying to a judge, might be the reason. He had his lips cut off. Now his grin was like the exposed teeth of a skull. Fuck. Next to him stood a woman leashed to another post. In her arms was a blue baby. The mother looked away, but my great-grandfather asked, "Still holding the kid? How did you kill your child?" "By suffocation." "Was there food enough?" "There was food enough," said the woman. But the child's wailing left no breath in the house. "When will you be released?" "In another night." "May your punishment prove too heavy." Before us, God, why do you have that on the way to the... Whatever. Before us were 2 great rectangular doors in the wall, side by side. A red granite gate. Before us were 2 rectangular doors in the wall, side by side. A red granite gate with a papyrus plant cut into it for the land of the north, and a limestone gate of white with a lily engraved above the door for the land of the south. Now a trumpet sounded. The huge red granite door began to open. "Enter, great lord and General Menenhet. Enter the honored family of Menenhet," a herald cried out, and then intoned, "Here in the year 7, under the majesty of the king of the south and the north, the beautiful Ka of Ra, beloved of Amon, son of the sun, see Ra Ramses IX, Horus, the strong bull who lives in the truth, welcomes you here. We enter in honor to his life, health, strength. Our pharaoh, the good Ptah Men Nim Hotep." Let's write his name down real quick so we can look it up. Ptah. NEM. Okay. We enter in honor to his life, health, strength, our pharaoh, the good Ptah Nemhotep, said Menedhedit, and turned to Bone Smasher, who had been walking on guard beside the sedan chair. An extra ration of bread and beer for your men and their oars, he said, as we were carried into the palace ground. Geese were flying overhead, and pigeons scattered before us. 3 hawks, I counted them, watched from a perch on the parapet. Definitely my least favorite chapter of this book so far. Well, not least. It was pretty funny. It was pretty good. A lot of lists. I don't like it when people just list stuff. But so, after this gross thing that happened between his mom and his great-grandfather, and also him, they take a boat ride to go see the pharaoh. I think it's the night after. Oh, and he gets BJ from Enya. What's Enya? And I guess you wonder why, and aren't they really love? I wrote a theme song for the show. Let's see if I remember it. Okay, hold on. I forgot it. So a theme song should be less than 5 seconds long for a podcast. Is that good? Some part of that. So then they go up the river and they see, is there some black marble obelisk thing that's south? Oh no, it would be north of the pyramids. It was fun. This is a good book. It's psycho. There's so many gross things in it, but I think all in all, it's not like a gregarious. I don't know what that word means. All right, we'll look up the word gregarious. It's not like over the top. Like I think that this guy's writing is fun, right? He's not like using a ton of like crazy words or things like that. So I mean, it's reachable for me to read and understand what I'm reading. But then again, I'm not reading stoned like I sometimes do. Let's look up the word gregarious. I don't even know how to spell it. Gregarious. G-R-E. Grenadine, gremlin, green. Gregarious. Fond of the companies of others. No. Okay, so I don't. Living in flocks or herds. Gregarious? I had no idea what that word means. I thought it was meant like over the top. Growing in open clusters or colonies, not matted together, pertaining to flocks or crowds. So kind of gregarious in nature. Quite fun to read. I'm really... if my throat felt better, my lungs weren't filled with what feels like peas. I don't know what fun I'm having reading that book, for real. I guess I want to keep talking for some reason. Oh, so yeah, they just slowly paddle, see all the sights. Hathfertidi seems to like to what's the word? Entertain the servants, or like the God, plebeians. What's the fucking word? The lesser people, Philistines. Come on, man. The lower class. She likes to entertain them, and will, if entertained by what they have to sell, and if she likes what they actually have to sell, will even buy stuff that she doesn't even want. It seems like, except for pour horse hooves on her tits, which is pretty cool too. God, rose hip tea is the best. They continue onward. Menenhedit too is kind of like showing off his knowledge of colors. Nothing that impressive though, if you ask me. Then they finally get there, and they're looking at all the shops and stuff, and he's remembering how he's been there before with Enya, or Enya, whatever his pedophile maidservant's name is. I can't remember. It's hard to say. When he's there, he's visited that town before, seemingly with just her, and he knows that people stare at her butt because that's the level he's at. That's how tall he is. So that's how young he is also. But he was happy to watch everything from the shore. He liked to see lines of people. He recalled the cliffs where he'd seen boys climbing the cliffs for honey, which is probably totally fucking worth it. Back in the day, or now, fuck it, I get stunned for some honey. And then they finally make it to the last walkway towards the Pharaoh's castle, whatever that's called. I don't know. And there's some fucked up people sitting around. One dude stole too much, so he had his hands cut off, and he had previously lied too much, so he had his lips cut off. But he was quite brainwashed into believing that he had deserved it, and that he is lucky to be alive. When I don't think I would be happy to be alive in that circumstance. I don't know. Maybe I'm just negative Nancy. But it sounds... I don't want that to happen to me. And then the lady who suffocated her child because it was too loud. We can all get that, right? She was in trouble. Just for a couple nights. What was the last thing they said? Some birds were flying around. All right.